Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another Timonspodcast. I'm your host, Timon, and this is my podcast, Cool Conversations with Cool People. And do I have a conversation today? But before we get to that, let's talk a little business. First off, this episode is sponsored by Jasmine. Jasmine owns Quiet River Massage and Revival located in Syracuse, Indiana. You can check out her information below in the show notes. For sure, go check out book a massage. She does 30, 60, 90-minute massages, hot rocks, essential oils. You're probably stressed, and Jasmine's got the cure for that. So thank you so much, Jasmine, for sponsoring today's episode. Secondly, this is for the Timonspodcast audience. If this is the first time you've listened to Timon's podcast, you can listen to this too. You're more than welcome to join in what I'm about to say, but this may not be as pertinent to you. But yes, guys, I know it's been maybe a month since I posted an episode, a Timon's podcast episode. Life has been busy. I am a dad. I am trying to figure out how to do all this stuff. So I've been since 2018 podcasting, and I've for the past probably 2 or 3 or 4 years posted, well, since 2020, almost every single week I've posted an episode, whether that was daily content or Timon's podcast or a dadcast. I've been posting a lot. So not posting for a month was a little weird. It was nice on my end, but it also was weird because I've got that itch to have conversations and post, and you know, I want to also bring content to you guys. But it was a little overwhelming in this time of life right now. So what I want to say is Timon's podcast is not finished. Timon's podcast is not going anywhere. I'm going to keep podcasting, but it may be a little bit more sporadic, not as consistent as once a week. And it's going to be people I want to talk to. So I think when I really feel an itch to talk to different individuals, I'll post a podcast. And sometimes maybe I've just done podcasts because I need to crank out content, right? Which is a good thing to do. But I'd rather have conversations with people I really want to talk to, and when I'm feeling comfortable enough to do it and when I can fit it in my schedule, just it's so busy. So with that being said, I really felt the urge to talk to this individual who I'm having on today. His name is Ryan Glick. He is on the school board in Goshen. So there's been some stuff that's happening in the local area here, and I saw it on Facebook. I'm like, hey, I need to get a hold of this guy. I kind of want to see what's going on. And with the former mayor pleading guilty to a felony, I felt like this might be a good time to understand what's going on in Goshen. And that's what Ryan did. I feel like he's the David and the Goliath scenario. And so I'm thankful for him coming and explaining what the role is, what he stepped into, what was going on during his time and after, and what's happening now. He did a really amazing job. So without me spoiling this whole episode, please enjoy my conversation with Ryan Glick. All right, we're live. Ryan.
All right.
Hey, thank you so much for coming, man.
Well, absolutely. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah. So let's. I mean, we've had a whole. We've already had a podcast.
Yeah, that's true.
That we're not going to air. It's here for just you and me. But I was wondering. Let's start out. Who you are, how you got to Goshen, some of those kind of basic stuff before we get into the.
Well, yeah, I was actually born in Goshen.
Okay.
So I was born at Goshen Hospital, but I spent all of my life up to 21 years old outside of town. So south of Goshen a little bit, and then north of Goshen. I didn't
like
do
the
a whole
New
lot.
Paris area?
No, actually on kind of Road 31, so just outside of town.
Okay.
Probably, a half mile from city limits.
Yeah, right outside town.
Right outside of town.
Yeah.
But I didn't do a whole lot inside of town. We were pretty country folk, so we enjoyed all the country stuff.
Yeah.
Then I went to Massachusetts and lived in Plymouth, Massachusetts for a couple months, and realized that the environment was a lot different than I was used to, and probably wasn't where I wanted to spend the rest of my life living in big town Massachusetts. So I moved down to North Carolina, spent 4.5 years there, working with some church groups, doing 501c3 work, volunteer.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
Worked on a lot of design stuff, which is where I first got into design work. Did some construction work down there. Ran a couple different businesses for myself, just dabbled in things that I felt like I had interested in.
Yeah.
Then I moved to Texas, also for work. Got hired by a land surveying company out there, worked for them for a while.
Oh, wow.
And that's where I met some people from Africa that were doing missions work over there.
Oh, very cool.
And they invited me to come over for about 6 weeks back in 2013. And after 6 weeks there, I said, why am I living in the U.S. when the skills that God had given me fit so perfectly in there?
Oh, wow.
So I moved there for 4 years.
Wow.
And then came back to the U.S., and I needed a job when I came back, and a company I'd worked for over a decade before said, hey, we're short-staffed, so we'll hire you.
No way.
So I started working here, doing that for a little while, again in construction.
Yeah.
Then I started working at a factory for a little bit, trying to see if I could bolster my income a little bit faster, and they switched me from the floor to marketing.
Oh, wow.
So I did more design work, learned how to do 3D art.
Oh, wow.
So I was doing all of their 3D marketing pictures. And then a marketing company hired me to do that full time.
Wow.
So that was the very condensed version of how
Yeah.
I got to Goshen.
There's so much right there that I want to talk about. Hey, so where'd you go in Africa?
I went to Malawi. It's a little country inside of Mozambique almost.
Yes.
Mozambique wraps around it, and it's about straight east of Madagascar.
Yes.
So totally landlocked, beautiful little country, very friendly people.
Yeah.
I started out doing it was basically business management for a missions organization that was on the ground,
Very cool.
helping them to get more organized,
Yes.
doing some Bible training. They had a pastoral training program on site, and then they also had an orphanage on site, so I was helping manage the books, basically.
Wow. So doing the accounting.
Yeah, doing the accounting because money was coming over from the U.S. and they needed to have somebody basically who was the interface between the Americans and the Africans.
Yeah.
And after I was there for a while, I thought, you know what? This is great, but it's not sustainable. And just, I saw some different things. I felt like I would like to have been more involved on the local stuff that wasn't as tied to the American funding.
Gotcha.
And that's where I got involved with Crown Financial Ministries.
Okay.
I don't know if you're familiar with them at all. They basically help people here in the U.S. to manage their finances to the glory of God.
Oh, okay.
But overseas, where finances aren't as big, they do a lot more. So it's, how do you manage your farm? How do you manage your business to the glory of God? How do you...
It's principle-based living, I'm sure.
Principle-based living. Once you become a Christian, what do you do after that point?
Mm-hmm.
How do you live for God? So I started looking at what they were doing, and they had a program called Farming God's Way or Foundations for Farming. It had previously been called Farming God's Way.
Okay.
Switched it to Foundations for Farming, so that it was easier to go into Muslim countries.
I was going to say it's a little more like low profile.
Yeah, it was a little more low profile because they were getting caught basically by Muslim areas, and they're like, no, you can't teach. But they would teach the same program, same principles, all biblically integrated. The gospel was put in throughout all the training.
Wow.
But it would teach people how to do organic farming.
Oh, wow.
And
you need that in Goshen.
Yeah. So I was super excited about that. They trained me, took a 6-week training course, got certified to teach over there.
Wow.
And so I ended up switching organizations to do that. So we ended up starting a training center. I helped them get a 24-acre farm.
Wow.
And we began work basically from the bush, trying to get that place up and running as a training center.
And self-sustaining.
And self-sustaining as much as possible.
Right, yeah.
It's still, excuse me, I had a little bit of cold, so it's still a work in progress.
Yeah.
There still is some outside support to it, but they're raising all sorts of crops on there. They've got some animals and stuff going on, and they bring people in from all across the country to train them, go back to their villages and teach their own people.
Wow.
How to do this.
It's impactful.
It's impactful.
Whether they're getting support or not, if you can start to grow some of your own produce and stuff, like it's
absolutely.
I'm a big gardener here. Like just this small little lot, I'm trying to grow things everywhere and do things all the time. Like, because I don't know, it tastes better.
Absolutely. If you can grow it, it's probably healthier too.
Oh, 100%.
Because you can control the inputs. You can decide how much, non-natural things you might want to throw at it.
Big into composting and just trying to let just come in a very heirloom-esque type stuff, like I seed save and things like that. So,
and if you look done right, the yields, especially overseas where they don't have as much implements where you're doing everything manually,
Mm-hmm.
the yield return on an organic plot over time is substantially greater because it deals with the acidity of the soil. So at least with Malawi, the soil was very acidic already. So when you start to dump fertilizer on, it raises the acidity even more.
Oh.
So
you
at the
can't-
first, you'll
interesting.
get a yield, and then the yield begins to drop and drop and
Right.
drop. And so people end up having to farm more land. Well, the bigger their farms got, because they don't have implements, they're doing it by hand, the lower the quality that they put into that work because
Right.
they had to do more. So
Right.
you're trying to do it fast. They would take shortcuts.
Oh,
Stuff wasn't to a high
wow.
standard. And so now not only does the soil produce less because it's deprived,
Right.
it produces less because the input is not as high quality.
Wow.
It's not too high a
It's
standard.
not how God wanted it.
It is not how God wants it.
Yeah.
So they would come in and say, no, you have to do it to a high standard
Yep.
without waste, with joy, to the glory of God.
Wow.
And if you do that, you're going to have great results in almost all instances.
Wow.
I mean, obviously, there are things that God can send your way
Yeah.
that you might not be able to deal with. But
He
even
might pull a
things
Job on you and destroy all your crops.
Correct. But even if you look at things like a drought, so the typical farming style, even sometimes here in the U.S., is
Mainly, I'm sure.
you cut everything off and it just, the ground can bake. You don't have anything on top of it.
Yes.
So
No
we
cover
were-
crop.
no
No,
cover
roots
crop.
going in there and breaking things up and soaking
Right.
it in water. Yeah.
So we taught them no till. You don't
Okay.
till it. You always have a mulch layer on top.
Yep.
That protects it.
Yep.
And
Before you came, we were raking all of our leaves and putting it on top of our beds right now.
Absolutely.
It's so funny. Yeah.
and what happens is the sun can't dry your ground out. So if you have a 3-week period with no rain,
Doesn't
your
matter.
crop doesn't die.
Yeah.
You know, they don't have irrigation systems like we do here to keep irrigating.
Yeah.
So that's a really huge thing.
Wow.
Excuse me. It can be life or death over there
Right.
with a small drought like that. If you got a period where it doesn't come and your crop dries up, you don't harvest.
Yeah. You probably don't have farmer's insurance.
No farmer's
Right?
insurance.
Or what-
And the government says, well, we'll give you food, but it's pretty lame.
Really?
So
yeah.
we were trying to basically make them resilient, make it so that they could survive
Wow.
and thrive even when they have things that aren't the best.
Right.
The other problem with just removing everything off the top, they would burn. So if you cut your crop down, all the stubble that's left, they'd burn it off. That kills nutrients. But during the rainy season, then all that bare soil can just wash away.
Right. So all
So
that you
it's-
did, and then that, yeah.
Everything you put into it washes off. So then it actually poisons the rivers because there's too much fertilizer running into it.
Oh, wow.
And all of your topsoil washes away. So all you've got is the subsoil.
Oh, yeah.
And you can't grow anything in it practically. So there's just a lot of things that went on that organic no-till agriculture could deal with and not just help you to continually have a crop, but to make it better every single year.
Right. And increase the yields.
It would increase the yield. So after a few years, you'd have a huge top layer soil and it was always protected. It wouldn't run off. The rains would come. It would soak into the ground
Right.
instead of just running away.
Right.
The sun couldn't bake the soil. It wouldn't turn into a brick.
Wow.
So in some places, I mean, they were growing even into the dry season. They could grow because the soil would be improved so much.
Wow. That's
So,
crazy.
Yeah, it was a really neat experience. So when I looked at that, it was like, I've got to learn how to teach this because this is something that will stay here with them
Yes.
long after I'm gone.
Yeah.
You know, I could feed an orphan for today,
Right. But
but if I teach the whole village how to farm
right.
and they produce enough food, the church could take care of those orphans way past my time in Africa.
Yeah. Yeah.
So-
and then those orphans can produce and sustain for themselves and then teach others to sustain. You know what I mean? It's just that's so God's economy too, where you plant a seed and multiple things like produce. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
It's not like just a one-on-one transaction. It's
Yeah.
you get
God-
the 100 yield or the 50 yield or
God's always talking about taking the little things that you have
yeah.
and making the most out of them. He doesn't expect you to develop SpaceX
Right.
when you're living in a village.
Yeah.
But he doesn't want you to look at your land and say, it's just land. I'm just going to leave it and let it go to waste.
Right.
He wants you to say, no, I gave you the land.
Yeah.
If you're faithful with little, I'll give you more.
Yeah, the talents.
There was one guy that I met when I was over there. They actually made a film about his life. He started out dirt poor, but he learned how to farm like this, learned how to manage a business, and took all those principles and by the time I met him, he was very well-to-do in the local economy.
Yeah.
And you would never have guessed that he started out as just a poor villager.
Wow.
But all it was faithfulness, doing it to a high standard, being honest, having integrity,
Yeah.
and working faithfully and all those things, and God blessed him.
Wow.
And we saw that over and over and over again.
That's beautiful.
Yeah. So that's what I did over there. I still love that type of thing. I still support the farm.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I will say it's interesting because prior to where I'm working now, I worked for an organization that was part of missions. It was business that facilitated and helped missions.
Okay.
But it was very interesting to peel back a layer and see how mission organizations ran. And it's unfortunate, some of the stuff that happens there.
That's true.
So, so maybe we could talk a little more off air about some of that stuff.
Yeah,
Because I was
absolutely.
plugged into that world for about 6 years.
Wow.
And I wasn't part of a mission organization, but I was rubbing shoulders with a lot of mission organizations and seeing
Right.
the way that they operate, and you're like, oh, that hurts. Oh, it's hard to watch some of that. So
Yeah.
I understand where you're like, if you're in management and you want to be there actually doing and making change, being in management could be very difficult. And then you see kind of how management's acting on one way and you see the need in the other, and
Yes.
it's hard to communicate back and forth sometimes. So
It is.
yeah.
Yeah, I found it actually much easier to mostly work with local people.
Yeah. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
Yeah. So then you move back to Goshen, you start working, and then you're working in the factories. You kind of get pulled, back into this world and start working for you said marketing company.
Marketing company, and I do full-time 3D modeling
That's awesome.
and imagery production,
Yeah.
all computer-based.
Oh wow. Is there a specific program you use to kind of
Yeah, it's actually a free program. It's called Blender.
Oh
So,
yeah.
if you're familiar with
Yes.
that, it's
I'm
an
very familiar.
extremely powerful program. It
Yeah.
takes a lot of time to learn how to use it well
Yeah.
and efficiently and get quality out of it. But
Yes. There's so many like Blender videos I've seen on YouTube that are just awful, right? They're not like high quality, but they're so funny.
Yeah.
So yeah.
But you can learn how to do that. So basically, the way I got into Blender, when COVID happened and all the businesses that were non-essential shut down,
Mm-hmm.
the company I was working for was considered essential because it was housing materials.
Okay.
But all the marketing for the company shut down because it didn't matter to them to market at that point.
Yeah.
All the companies they were trying to sell to were basically shutting down.
Wow. Okay.
So unless, they sold to a lot of stock companies and stuff like that. So they were only selling basically to their actual builders. There wasn't any new customers coming in.
Right.
So we also had a retail store that probably was 90% of my marketing work.
Okay.
And that store shut down because it was not considered essential.
Wow. Okay.
So I sat there and I was like, well, I'm getting paid and I'm not doing anything. And I knew we had hired a company out of Texas to do 3D imagery for us.
Yeah.
I said, well, I've got some time. I might as well try and learn this myself. And so for 2 weeks, I sat down and learned Blender and made my first kitchen
Wow. Out of Blender. Wow.
out of Blender. Yep.
And then from there,
And from there, it went into a full-time job.
that's awesome.
So
It's crazy with those. If you take those 2 weeks and do something productive, like what
Absolutely.
that could do and change. And
it does help to be paid for the 2 weeks.
Yes.
But,
Yes.
I was like, I don't want to sit here and waste my time.
Yeah,
They're
that's
paying me good money, so I need to benefit them in some way.
yeah.
And, now I make everything from outdoor furniture to interior specialty, custom hardwood furniture.
Wow.
All sorts of stuff like that.
Just real custom to like
Yeah.
real basic all across the board.
Yeah. So, a lot of Amish companies that are building to order.
Yes.
I'll make their sets up. Oftentimes they don't have anything in stock. So they'll say, hey, we want to, produce imagery of this, but they don't necessarily have it, or they've got a product that's getting ready to ship out. They're like, well, it's not going to be something we could send to a studio and photograph it.
Right.
So I make it and put it into a house.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
I do outdoor buildings, log cabins. Yeah, all sorts of stuff.
Yeah. That's so cool. Yeah. That's crazy.
Yeah, it's very exciting. I enjoy it.
Yeah.
And it fits in well with an artistic bent, which I've always had.
Right. Yeah. That's, well, if you know construction and stuff too, you can kind of tie all those pieces
Correct.
together. Yeah. It sounds like your skill set has just grown. The way I got kind of connected with you was I saw a post on Facebook of John Troyer.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, it was your post that mentioned John Troyer, and then a buddy of mine commented on it and mentioned John Troyer. And so I watched the clip where John talks to the school board, And
Yes.
that's what started me down the road of watching some of the podcasts and things. So can you talk about how you got on? We'll chat about that in a little bit, but I'd like to know how you go through all these things. Now you're here in Goshen. How did you get on the school board?
Well, it was not something I was looking at doing.
Okay.
I've always been conservative, and I do believe that conservatism is beneficial to society.
Yeah.
If it's well thought out.
Yes.
And that's very important to me. I believe that conservatism can be very logical if we are willing to study the issues and think them through and base it on biblical truth and make wise decisions.
Yeah.
So I wasn't thinking particularly about the school board, but I did see an article in the Elkhart True saying that there were some open seats on the Goshen Schoolboard, and I heard an interview with somebody who was running, and it got me interested. So I started talking to some different people, and I thought, well, maybe I should put my name in the hat.
Yeah.
You know, it can't hurt, and it looks like the Goshen School Board could use some improvement.
Yeah. A little conservatism.
Right.
Yeah.
It could use some conservatism on there, and basically try to make it so that it runs well.
Yeah.
Having come from a business background, I know that a public school is not exactly like a business,
Right.
but there are a lot of business principles that if we would just apply them, we'd find it much more efficient.
Yeah.
There's a lot of wastage that goes on in any level of government.
Yes.
And public schools are not immune to the wastage.
Yeah.
And so when you look at the amount of money being spent per student and the actual outcomes of that money, everybody, even, Education Weekly, it doesn't matter, all these leftist groups too, would say, we need a better return on our investment. Something's not working right. So I felt like that I had something that I could run on and connect with people over. At the same time, in fact, the same day I decided to run, I found out my wife was expecting. So
Oh, wow.
we had a lot of fun in that particular period of time. Unfortunately, she didn't have morning sickness. She had all day sickness.
Oh, no.
So she was sick for the entire 9 months.
Oh, wow.
And I was trying to campaign and all that other stuff at the same
tension.
time. Yeah.
And you had a kid at this point, too.
And we had another child
so
at that point.
How you watch a kid and then also, wow.
So there was a lot going on there. But my wife was really supportive. She helped me out and as best she could. I don't think she was ever able to come to any of my campaign events because she was sick. So she tried a couple times and was like, no, I'm going to be thrown up. It's not going to work. But we got through it. So let me back up, though. As I looked at running, again, I believe conservatism has good logical arguments behind it.
Mm-hmm.
But you aren't going to arrive at it unless you study the issues.
Mm.
And so what I felt like, if I'm going to run for the school board, I want to study as much as I can to be able to argue my position in a way that it makes sense to everybody. And I don't want it to make sense only to conservatives.
Right.
Because they aren't the entire constituency. I want it to make sense to everybody.
Right.
And I do believe that those principles, when applied properly, will benefit pretty much everybody. Unless you want to be a lawbreaker.
Right. Yeah.
And then it does not benefit you.
Then it kind of hurts you sometimes,
And
I'm sure.
it can might hurt you.
Yeah.
Because
But
those laws are there for a purpose.
Yeah.
So I spent a ton of time just studying to say, okay, how do I be the best school board member I could be? How do I look at all these different issues, identify what needs to change, and realize I'm dealing with teachers, I'm dealing with students, I'm dealing with parents, I'm dealing with the government and their laws, I'm dealing with expectations, I'm dealing with community members who don't have kids in the schools.
Right.
But, they look at how they were raised, their education, what's coming out of the schools now. Like, there's a lot of people involved in this whole thing. And then everybody pretty much pays taxes, whether you're a renter and you pay it through your rent, or if you're a property owner, you pay property taxes. So you've got all those people who are looking at the public schools and saying, we want to have, input here too. And as I studied it, I realized I could put this together in a way that makes sense to people. Now, there's always going to be illogical people who will oppose your position regardless of how much sense it might make.
Yeah, because they're tribal. They just are part of a group and you're not part of it. Therefore, you're always going to be
correct.
Yeah.
And
you have that everywhere.
You have that everywhere. Yeah. You can either get all bent out of shape about that, or you could say, well, guess what? I'm going to demonstrate what I'm talking about. and show you how it can benefit you, even if you disagree with me. And apparently that worked. By the time the race was finished, I was able to come out on top with a 3-way race.
Wow.
Both people I was running against were more well-known than I was by far, because at the time, basically nobody knew who I was.
Yeah.
And I hadn't been doing anything to try
You've
to
been
become...
in Africa for a while. Yeah,
I've been overseas, and, I was in Goshen for like a week and 4 days before the general election. So,
wow.
I mean, I just barely met the 1-year requirement.
Wow.
And all my neighbors were Hispanic and everything like that. So I was getting to know them, but, it was not like I'd been out there trying
Staple of the community, moving and shaking for years.
Correct. It wasn't. I was new. I was new to the area, but I was able to put together that campaign with that mentality that this is going to benefit everybody. And so I talked to everybody. I didn't limit it to people who I thought would agree with me. I spent plenty of time with people who wouldn't.
Yeah.
But I was able to get supporters out of that because they realized, hey, these
genuine.
These
he wants to do something.
Ideas aren't just for one group of people.
Right.
They benefit everybody.
Right.
And especially with areas of transparency, honesty, wise use of money, looking at how do we engage our students with a goal of where we want them to be, not just meet some ideas that we've got like right now.
Some standards that are
right. What we want to look like in the community, but where are we trying to go and how do we get there?
Right.
Those things resonated with people. So, after 2 months, we had that election, and then we had some things that happened in there that are still ongoing. And
which is what we'll talk about a little bit
absolutely.
more. Yeah.
So that was kind of how I got onto that school board race.
Wow.
It was a last minute deal, but
you went about it in a good order, and it seemed to work out. Can you kind of explain what a school board does, maybe to people who
So the purpose of the school board is to basically provide the general direction of the school system. We set the goals, we set the policies by which the school system is going to operate. We make sure that we're in compliance. We say, hey, these are programs we approve, these are programs we don't. We go over, we approve curriculum or different offerings that we give to students, different support things for the students. Yeah. The school board does not manage the schools on a day-to-day basis.
It's just a high-level direction.
It is high-level direction, and we hire and fire the superintendent, which is probably the most important job of the school board.
Wow. So that's it. That's like one of the big things is...
Yes.
But you're not hiring and firing anyone else.
We are not.
Inside those rooms.
We do under the recommendation of the superintendent, so we will have to approve a fire or approve hires through.
Gotcha.
Well, actually, I think they are allowed to do hires for basic level stuff. If it's new positions in the admin, we would vote on those positions, stuff like that. So they can hire. When it comes down to firing staff, that's usually a board vote.
Okay.
With all of that, though, because it's such a high level thing, with the superintendent being hired by the board, you have to choose really well. Because basically he's going to take everything that you've said and everything you voted on and implement it.
Yeah.
And either he can do a good job or he can do a bad job.
Right.
And he can either work with you or he can work around you.
Right.
And those are really big, serious issues for a school system.
Yeah.
So to me, that is probably the most important thing, that we choose as a board a good superintendent.
Choosing like the CEO of the company.
You're choosing the CEO.
The vision director, the person that's shooting the vision, pushing the mission, and kind of making everything work towards the direction that you as the board is setting. Okay.
There's a lot of similarities to a city government. Okay. Now, in a city government, the city council does not elect the mayor.
Gotcha.
But the way the city government works is similar to a mayor and a city council.
Gotcha.
The mayor runs the day-to-day operations of the city. The city council doesn't. But the city council sets the rules, the laws. They vote on those types of things and give that to the mayor. Now, the mayor has veto power. Superintendent doesn't.
Right.
The board has total control. When the board votes, that's what the standard is.
Right. City council can't fire the mayor. Where
we can.
Yeah.
But the way that the mayor runs the city is similar to the way a superintendent would run the schools.
Gotcha. Okay.
So that's a great way to think about it. Sometimes people come to me and like, well, hey, I had this issue in my kid's class. Can you take care of it? No, I can't.
Yeah.
And if
Yeah.
you got an appeal structure, you could go, follow that appeal structure. It goes to the superintendent, but that's not my job as a board member.
Right. Right.
Now, other issues where, it's dealing with policy, where policy is being violated. If it's gone through all that, there's actually a system that it can be appealed to the board, and then it becomes a board issue. But before that point, it's not.
Yeah. Wow. Interesting. Okay. So yeah, and I don't think I don't know if it was for me, but I felt like COVID really made me aware of how much power was actually the local community had over your life. A lot more than I always would just think about the governor and the president and maybe some Congress, right? I'm like, those are the elections I would really pay attention to, but they impact your life, but not as much as city local stuff.
There is a lot of effect.
Yeah.
A lot of people think that all it really matters excuse me, it is the federal and the state level stuff.
Right.
And so when elections come up for these local levels, they're like, it doesn't really matter. My life doesn't change that much.
Right.
Depending who's in there.
Well, you see the numbers. Percentage-wise, the people that vote during those elections versus the people who vote during the federal, it's like a
drastic
fraction of the percentage.
Yes.
Yeah.
So very few people end up controlling your local government because those are the ones that vote.
Wow. Yeah.
And they don't necessarily represent who the whole community is. It's just they were the only ones that cared enough to do something about it.
Do something. Yeah. Wow.
And we might think, well, does my life really change day to day based on who's in there? Well, maybe not because of who's voting, but if we had the right people run, maybe it would affect your life more.
Right.
Or you would realize how much it actually affected your life.
Right.
When
And I think a lot more people realized that during 2020. At least
Correct.
I did. I was like, oh my word. Yeah, they have a lot more control. This person in my community has a lot more control over my life than I even was aware of. So,
Correct.
Yeah. Maybe not so much on the school board for me because I don't have kids who go through that. But I think as parents are starting to wake up, I know across the country, school boards have been a contentious battleground of ideas and conversations. And even during COVID, things were getting kind of a little crazy. I just remember seeing things in the media and the news.
How much should the school board protect us?
Right.
And how much should parents be allowed to make the decision on what protection they want?
Right.
What should be forced down, what shouldn't be, what statistics and facts you're going to listen to.
Right.
There's a lot of stuff. There was a lot of ideological opinions that went into decisions.
On everyone type
Correct.
I remember things like that where people were getting really frustrated and they're like, this doesn't make sense, but we're going to do this because this is what we're going to do.
It makes us feel good.
Yeah.
Makes us feel good. Yeah. So there's definitely issues here that affect people's lives. Yeah. And then, just as far as a school board and a community, that is our next generation.
Mm-hmm.
So if a school board is setting the policy and the direction and what types of materials can be brought into the schools, what things are going to be taught by teachers, that's a really important job because it affects so much down the road. Those young people are going to be the people that affect our future.
Yeah. It's crop growing.
Correct.
You're creating the soil.
What type of thing? What type of thing are you going to put in there? What type of
fertilizer and topsoil that runs right off? Okay, or do you want organic, deep rooted, topsoil for? Yeah,
absolutely.
I dig that. Yeah.
Yeah. So we've got to make sure that what is being put in is high quality, good stuff that will have good fruit down the road.
Right.
Otherwise, we'll look at the results down 20 years on and be like, what happened?
Right.
We don't know. Well, way back then, we had bad inputs.
Right.
We had bad things going on,
and of course now it's going to have the effect now.
Correct.
Wow. Okay. Another question for you: in the school board, how many people sit on? Is it like 9 or?
We have 7.
7. Okay.
Yes.
Are you was there a conservative point of view prior to you on the school board? Is there a conservative kind of group there now, or? And I'm sure it's a spectrum because
it's a spectrum.
You can't.
Yeah.
It's not like we're not tribal. It's not this group, this group, this group.
Right.
But I was just wondering, as you walked in, were you walking in with, okay, well, there's a couple like-minded people, or I'm solo trying to carve a path over here by myself? Or
I think in some ways I was solo.
okay,
It could have been a lot better. So
yeah,
in a lot of ways I was solo. Now, since I've been on there and I pushed for some of this stuff, again, issues aren't just for me, like for my own sake, but things that are good for everybody.
mm-hmm.
Again, the transparency issues, making sure our meetings are legal, making sure that we're talking about stuff, engaging the right people, making sure that people have an input when they want to have an input, things like that. I think we've gotten a lot better since I got on there. So there's been a shift over, which has helped.
Yeah.
But when I got there, definitely I was trying to right that ship by itself.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. You're the only one tugging to go this way while everyone's
Correct.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Yeah. So I guess now, thank you for kind of explaining a lot of that stuff.
Yeah,
'cause
absolutely.
I had no clue about some of that. And I those are things I was wondering as well. It's like, yeah, how hard was it to come in as yourself? But a lot of stuff in our local environment now is being exposed to some of the things that were happening prior to you coming on. During your election, there was stuff happening. And like I said, that's the reason why I reached out in the first place.
Right.
So I'd love you had created a 7-part series, a podcast, where you kind of explained in depth and like walked people through all of the details here. And as I'm talking to you, I get to understand how you think and why you think the ways you think. I'm like, it's really cool. So I'd love to hear a little bit about what's going on there, if you want to.
Yeah, it was a big issue.
Yeah.
And you're right. I did make a 7-part podcast. And the reason behind that was
I'll link the
Okay.
podcast so people can go and listen to that too.
That'd be great.
So, yeah.
It's very hard sometimes to tell people exactly what was going on. And from the surface, I think there's a lot of interpretation that I was just basically got ticked off that somebody said something bad about me and I was going to, try to chase them down over that, which that wasn't the reasoning behind it at all. And the complexity of the case behind the scenes is kind of like an iceberg. There's this form up here at the top that people are saying, why are you so worried about one little form? And it's like that was the tip. You had this entire mammoth iceberg down below here
of
corruption that was going on. And that's why I've made a case out of it, because that can't continue. It's got to stop.
Yeah.
And it does hurt our students. And people were manipulating the system to maintain their control of that. Whether or not another person would have been able to get elected or not, that's not the point. But the issue was that the system was being manipulated, and that's illegal.
Right.
You can't do that.
Right.
So basically what happened was right before the election. So the election that year was November 8th,
Okay.
I believe. On October 29th, a mailer showed up that went to the entire Elkhart, what do they call that? Elkhart district.
Yeah. Elkhart. Yeah.
I forget what the terminology for that is. So it's all of Goshen, outside of Goshen.
Yes.
It wasn't just Goshen schools areas. Some of people got it that were in Wani district and other districts around Middlebury district, because it was actually the Elkhart area. And I wish I had the term off the top of my head, but I'm forgetting it.
Yeah.
That went to. So when the mailer came out, I looked at that and I was shocked because some of the claims in it were so outrageous.
Yeah. I remember getting that mailer. I mean, I was like, what is this? And I'm like, what is this? It kind of like, I think the intended purpose on my opinion was to really bash, but it kind of made me like question.
Right.
Like, why am I getting this? And then it started to like unfurl some stuff. Like, what is this all about? In a place where I wasn't even aware of it. I wasn't even thinking about it. I wasn't paying attention to it. I didn't even know something was happening. I know there was really election going on with the school boards, and then I get this Purple for Parents mailer. And I start reading. I'm like, oh, there's actually stuff happening here that I need to be paying attention to.
Right.
It's just kind of crazy.
Yeah. Well, the mailer had on one side 3 incumbents who were running for re-election and the mother of a 4th board member who was stepping down to run for state office.
Okay.
So her term was up, but she was not running for re-election. And so that was the one side of the mailer advocating who they were.
Yep.
And the other side was warning the community about 3 of their opponents,
Right.
myself being one of them. The backstory to that, after we did some public records requests, we found out that they were basically so concerned about Purple for Parents and their involvement in that race, and people who had a conservative mindset getting onto the board, they felt they had to do something drastic. Basically get the information out about them, warn the community about them. My involvement was that I got an endorsement from Purple for Parents. I'd never been involved with them before, and I still don't really do anything with them now. I ran on my own 2 feet. I ran under my own principles and what I believed and how I thought it would help the community. I've had some people say, well, why aren't you, owning your involvement in Purple for Parents? Well, I'm not involved in them.
Right.
I got
They
an
just
endorsement.
say, hey, we like you.
It was an endorsement. That was it.
Yeah.
I ran on my own platform.
And how many
my
other
principles.
people endorsed you? Like businesses and things? I mean, there's probably tons of people who endorse you that...
Yeah, I had other people that, they didn't necessarily write full-on endorsements, but said, hey, we're going to support you and vote for you.
Right. Right. Put your sign out in front of their house and...
At the time, because I was a newbie, I was like, hey, somebody said, let's vote for him.
Yeah.
I was like,
I'll take it.
Right. I'll take it.
Yeah.
And in general principles, I would agree with a lot of what they have to say.
Right.
So, hey, you know what? We need to have good quality education. But people who try to say, well, that makes you a hate group or a hate candidate, that's what was basically put into the mailer. Right. Know the candidates' agendas. Know what they're trying to do here. They tried to claim that we were putting at risk the relationship of the schools with the city, that the schools could no longer be great schools anymore if we got on. They said that we were opposed to people based on where they were born and if they didn't speak English and a whole bunch of other stuff.
Wow.
So there was a lot of claims being made.
Right.
But then they also tried to tie me to one of the other candidates by saying I was their son-in-law.
Yeah.
Which I had to honestly laugh because my in-laws lived in Ethiopia at the time and they weren't running for school board in Goshen.
Yeah. Where did that come? It was just like... Because they talk about nepotism, and that was a thread in that mailer.
Yeah, it seemed like
they're
it
all
was
related,
nepotism.
and they're trying to...
When people questioned them afterward, like at the West Goshen Neighborhood Association meeting that we had where the candidates all came and spoke, Doug Nicely was there from the city council, and he kind of was questioned, why did you guys say this? And they were all, we don't know where it came from. We just heard that and, went on with it. But they didn't question it. And I look at it, it's like, well, why did you put it in there? What was your goal? Because they didn't state that their own candidate was the mother of a sitting board member.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
But they point out that I'm a relative of this person that they're trying to attack. And what I think happened is they didn't know who I was.
Yeah.
And they thought, well, if we can lump everybody kind of into a group and then paint the whole thing black, they'll think I'm terrible.
Right.
And hey, you know what? It sounds bad if you say, well, a mother-in-law and son-in-law are running for a school board, right? You're trying to game the system in some way.
Then on the other side, it was literally,
so that was in there. And I looked at that and was like, well, this is a great opportunity to basically show people this isn't to be trusted. Like they can't even get that right. But then where it went on and saying, we're not supporting people that were born out of the country and all of that. Right. My entire family wasn't born in the U.S. at that time. I hadn't had my second child, so my whole family was born overseas. Wow. I was the only one that wasn't. And my wife learned English in a country that doesn't even have English as a primary language.
Wow. Yeah.
And she was able to go out and get a master's degree and all this other stuff like that. She's very well educated.
Yeah.
And she speaks perfect English. And it's like, okay, this has nothing to do with where you're born, what language you speak, or anything else.
Right. You're just trying to slander. Yeah.
We were trying to argue that there was, poor teaching going on, poor quality in the education, resulting in students not learning how to speak English as well. And so that's not an attack on a student who doesn't speak English. It's saying, no, we can probably do better than we're doing.
Right.
It's actually, if you want to call that an attack, quote unquote,
it's on the teachers.
but it's actually on the ones who are doing less of a quality job. Now, that's not always the teacher's fault. A lot of that is, how does the administration impact this?
Right.
How does the curriculum get chosen? What is the support system? So there's a lot of people that are going to be involved in that. It's not always one person.
Right. It's complex.
It is very complex. But as a system, part of being a public school is you figure out how to make that system work. You don't just say, well, we're doing the best we can and we're just going to go with it, even if people aren't learning.
Where's the waste? Where's the things that can be cut, the improvements?
Right. How do we streamline it? How do we make sure the teachers know how to teach?
Yeah.
Now, some people say, well, you can't control what a teacher teaches. A teacher should be able to, teach what they think is best. Well, nobody actually believes that.
Yeah.
Nobody actually believes that at all. You can't have every teacher walk in the door with their own curriculum and try and teach.
Yeah.
Your school will fall apart.
Yeah. You need direction in uniformity.
Every system.
They built together. And
yes. Every system in the world. Doesn't matter if it's human-made, God-made, out in nature. Every system has some way to work together.
Yeah.
And if it is not cohesive and working together, it falls apart because
Right.
a house divided against itself doesn't stand.
Yeah.
So if you teach one thing and I teach another thing and they are disjointed and moving you along at different times, the system falls apart.
Wow.
So the whole claim that, well, you can't tell a teacher what to teach or how to teach, well, that's not true.
Right.
And that's what a school board does. It sets the policy, determines whether or not the curriculum gets used. So there was many things that were tied into that, but it has nothing to do with, well, we're rejecting somebody because of where they were born.
Yeah. No, and I went to a Rotary meeting, and at the Rotary meeting, I think it was the superintendent who came and talked, or a principal. I forget who it was. He drives an old car. He loves driving his old car places. So he came and he talked. And he was talking about how the reading comprehension is low for Goshen, but it makes sense because the majority of the students' first language is not English.
Right.
And so when you have that unique problem of, how many kids are, my neighbors, they came here a couple of years ago, kids are like 12 and 8,
Yep.
They're stuck right into third grade and intermediate school, but they're learning English right now. Like, how are they going to be able to read like a 12-year-old reads who's lived in Goshen and has grown up? Like, my daughter will read English really well because I've been teaching. I mean, that's how we talk. So it's
absolutely.
like I totally understand what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's a very complex issue, but
Yeah.
that makes it all the more important that you have a vision, a plan, and a cohesive strategy to get there.
Yeah, instead of just willy-nilly.
Instead of willy-nilly. You got to have that strategy. And so part of what we've been doing as a board and with the superintendent that we have now is setting that goal, narrowing it down, saying how do we make cohesion from these grades below all the way up, and then have supports for the students who come in. They're in the middle, right?
Right.
They're already behind because, they're not a native English speaker and they're jumping into the system.
Right.
How do we do with that?
Halfway through the year, typically.
Yeah.
In middle school, boom, plopped right in. Good luck. Yeah.
Right. It's very difficult. It's not something that you're going to solve overnight. And you know what? When you have an environment like that, you probably will never have the same scores as, some little farming community that's made up of people who have been born here, raised here.
Yeah, Carmel, Indiana, or whatever. Yeah, exactly. I won't point it.
I do firmly believe, I look at my wife and say she learned how to speak fluent English in a non-English speaking country.
Yes.
We'd better be able to teach our own language.
Right.
So how do we do that?
Wow.
And how do we not look at it and say, well, we're just where we're at because we have so many non-native English speakers, and then, I guess that's just where we're at.
Wow.
How do you say, no, we must strive for better?
Yeah.
Even if it's 1% a year, we strive for better. We strive to become better at what we do.
Yeah.
We've got an audit going on, kind of looking at all of our systems and our processes in the schools right now to try to say, are we doing the best with what we've got? Are there areas where we need to improve, get outside eyes looking in? Those are the types of things that are so important because it's all right to acknowledge you're not where you need to be.
Right.
To look at what we're doing and say, we need to improve.
Yeah.
That's, like before I said,
That's
if you're
growth.
saying we're attacking something, it's not attacking, it's acknowledging a problem.
Yeah.
But it is a statement on a school board that wants to say, no, we're the best school system, and anybody who says we're not doing well, they're attacking teachers, they're attacking students of other nations. It's not true.
Wow.
Now, is everybody who's made a criticism perfect? No.
Right.
But part of life is dealing with imperfect people. You don't just say, well, everything you say now is therefore a bad criticism because I didn't like this one thing you said. Look at what is being generally advocated and deal with it honestly.
Right.
Don't just say, well, you must be a hateful person.
Right.
And so, I looked at that whole mailer and I said, well, this is actually a springboard to tell people what I actually believe. So I carried a copy with me. When I went door knocking, I was like, hey, you get the mailer? Think about this.
That's crazy.
Here's some truth about what I believe, and here's what I want to do. Here's how I think some changes on the school board could make an impact to everybody, whether they're a native English speaker or not, whether they're, somebody born in Goshen or somebody who moved here. Doesn't matter. These will help improve it. And I think I got actually a lot of support out of that. It made people want to know, what did I really believe?
They start pulling on the thread.
Correct.
Because they were like given, and they start looking at it and like, okay, what?
Yep.
Yeah, unraveling. That's wild. Okay.
So that was part of it. But where the real issue for me came up then is I started hearing some rumors about how the thing was funded. And I don't remember where those rumors came from. It's been a couple years now, but I remember I had heard something. I'm like, that's weird. Myself and a couple other people started looking into it, and I thought, I need to tackle this because there's something strange going on.
Yeah.
Even within 2 days of the mailer coming out, people were questioning something about the funding in that mailer.
I remember seeing something on Nosy Neighbors of Michigan, which has changed to Neighbors of Michigan. Yeah. I remember seeing something, I think it was right after the election, right? Early November of that year. And people were talking about the kind of the I felt like it was a stolen election was kind of the verbiage. And someone had came and talked at a meeting, maybe a council meeting, and then there was also the comment about the funding. I remember early just seeing that on Neighbors of Michigan.
There was definitely some talking going on about it. Now, some people have said, it was stolen. I don't think it was stolen. I think it was manipulated.
Well, and that's a really easy thing to say these days.
It's easy to say, but I think there was a manipulation going on. There's advantages being taken, and it definitely wasn't being transparent as to who was behind what was happening.
Yes.
There was definitely some things that got uncovered that were unethical and illegal being done. So I had written a letter to the editor, I think the day after that mailer arrived. So it arrived the 29th, the 30th. I wrote a letter to the editor, printed the 31st, which was a Monday. So it was a Saturday that it came. Monday they printed it. The day after that, or maybe 2 days after that, I forget exactly, Alan Kaufman, who was on the board, wrote a letter to the editor back. And he basically said, I got the mailer in the mail as well, and I've read Ryan's letter to the editor opposing it, and I looked over this, and except for the son-in-law part, if I was one of the candidates, I don't think they have anything to apologize for at all, and everything else they said. Everything else is accurate. But it was very much this nonchalant, like,
dismissive.
I just got this thing in the mail, and I just kind of looked over it, and immediately that made me question him because I knew he was Jose Elizalde's campaign manager.
Right, yes.
And it's like, all right, so you've got 3 incumbents on this mailer. You got the mother of a 4th board member on the mailer. And you're a campaign manager, and you didn't know your own guy that you're running his campaign put out a mailer? Like, how did that even happen? A campaign manager, if he's worth his salt, knows what type of
he's
campaign.
The one pushing this stuff.
He's the one pushing it.
Yeah.
And so
come to find out, but anyway.
I basically went on Facebook, on his own Facebook, and I questioned him. I'm like, you said this, because he had actually posted his letter to the editor publicly on his Facebook page. Yeah. I'm like, this doesn't make any sense. Is that the truth? Is that really what happened? And he said, well, I'm not ashamed to say I actually wrote the thing.
He said that?
Yeah, on Facebook. And I'm like, well, that is certainly not what you put in your letter to the editor.
Yeah.
You made it appear like you were an independent third-party observer. And he tried to say, well, I tried to see if they changed anything on the mailer after I gave them text, all this other stuff. I'm like, no. Yeah. You guys didn't mail this out without even seeing it. Like, you knew what that mailer looked like.
Yeah.
And when we were at the West Goshen Neighborhood Association meeting, Andrew Johnson said, yeah, I got the copy of this beforehand. I approved everything on it. It's like, if all of these candidates are approving it, the campaign manager approved it.
Right.
Once we pulled the public records, we found out that they were communicating even using a school board email, which is how we got the public record of the email strings.
Wow.
Alan Kaufman presented the idea all the way at the very beginning. It was his idea to do the mailer. He was the one that wrote it. He's the one that got them to want to, get together and put all their pictures on it.
He's the puppet master behind it.
He was the puppet master behind it. So for him to say, if I was one of the candidates, I would say that only, apologizing for the in-law part.
Yeah.
He was basically saying they were wholly responsible and he had no responsibility. If I was one of the other candidates, I'd have been mad. It'd been like, you wrote it and you're trying to put all the blame on us.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of blame shifting. There was a lot of trying to misguide, mislead, muddy the waters, hide it.
Covered under the rug.
And the second question I had really, besides, who came up with the mailer, was who paid for it? Because, I was hearing these different things. So I asked him who paid for it. And he tried to go into, the candidates put down that it was paid for by the candidates committee. But at the West Goshen Neighborhood Association meeting, Roger Knopfsinger had said it was paid for by multiple community people. And I didn't know what to believe. What I really wanted to do was say that not only did he write it, he paid for it, because I was like, you need to take responsibility for this. Quit trying to blame shift. Mm-hmm. I didn't, have a vision as to where I was going with that, but I felt like he was not being honest with the public. As a board member, as a campaign manager. He was trying to blame shift here. Mm-hmm. Well, we pulled the campaign finance records, and because the donations were so large, if it was over $1,000 up to 2 days before the election, you have to file a form within 48 hours.
Right.
And that form showed himself as the donor. So I went back to him. I'm like, you said that other people paid for it, but this is you paid for it.
Right.
So now somewhere we're lying again.
Right.
You're trying to say you weren't really behind it. All these other people were behind it, but the forms say you did it. Well, he said, no, I had somebody who came to me and she did the fundraising. I don't have to identify this person. Now, I was brand new to campaigning, but that was like, there's no way that's legal. Yeah. So I went and filed some reports, and some other people did too, with the election board, and said, hey, this is what they're saying. I want to file a complaint about that, because I did pull up the laws then, and I was like, no, that's not legal. Right. You have to declare your donors.
Can I interject real quick? Just Absolutely. 2 seconds. For people who may not know, Alan Kaufman was our mayor.
Correct.
For a long time.
18 years.
Yeah. Like when I moved to Goshen when I was 2. I think he was mayor like right around then or after. And so that's the one that I grew up with. So someone who's been the leader of Goshen for 18 years, you would think would know how. I just like the campaigning pieces, the government. I mean, you have to cross your T's and dot your I's.
You have
over and over and over and over
and
again.
It's not for to benefit a group of people. Yeah. It's just so that you know who's influencing your elections. Right. Right. If you're going to be dumping money into a campaign, other people have a right to know who's backing you, because sometimes you can tell a lot about a person by who backs them. Yes. What, they might not be totally forthwith about who they are.
Right. Or it's a tale as old as time. Like, I'll pay you to get you in, and then you do something I scratch your back, you scratch my back. Like.
Right. And if you hide all that.
Right.
Nobody knows.
Right.
Because we have no way of knowing what was involved.
Right.
So, yeah. And he was actually, I think it was 15 years or something that he was on city council before he was mayor.
So, yeah. So he's had a deep. So it's not like someone who's never been in politics. Oops, I made a mistake. Right. It's someone who's lived in this world for years. This is, his legacy. Right. And then is being in the background, being a campaign manager. And knows how to, yeah.
It also wasn't like, I didn't realize you weren't allowed to gather some funds from friends and then, donate it and put my name down. He said the purpose in putting his name down was to hide the donor.
Wow.
The donor made the condition of their donating and doing a fundraiser on being hidden.
Wow. Yeah.
So, I mean, that's a big issue.
Yeah.
We're not talking about just simple mistakes. We're talking about intent to hide, deceive.
Yeah.
And that's where I felt like this was a big issue. And I wasn't going to make a big deal about them saying things that weren't true about me, but I was going to make a big deal about this other part because that affects our elections. And it's not just this election. You know, if they were willing to do that in this one, Alan Kaufman said under oath that he had done some of this stuff in the past 13 elections he was involved in.
Wow.
So, and this is a way of doing business in Goshen.
Right.
By some of these people.
Right.
It needed to stop. Yeah. And that meant you follow this thing through. You don't just say, oh, well, okay, you know, mistake made. Let's all just be happy and go on with things. Mm-hmm. You've got to fight it out to the end. So when I looked over the laws, I realized these things aren't just campaign finance issues with a civil penalty. They're criminal penalties tied to it. And I said, well, I'm gonna file a police report. You know, I'm gonna take this thing to the law and say, hey, these were crimes being committed by our elected officials, and they need to be held accountable because this is who represent our community. And in the idea of a school board setting policy for a school system, honesty and integrity is a huge part of a standard for a school system.
Right.
If we don't have an honest, open, transparent board, not only are your elections going to be messed up, your school system is going to be messed up because you can't create...
You're sweeping it just to get in. What are you sweeping while you're in there?
Right.
Right. What's the stuff that... Which we kind of talked about prior to...
Yes.
Yeah.
I found out my suspicions were true, that there was a lot of junk going on the school board itself that tied directly to this idea of being honest, filing the proper paperwork, not lying to the public about what was being discussed. So that whole system started a whole series of election board meetings. They investigated, I think, for the next 5-6 months before they finally forwarded over a whole pile of misdemeanors and one felony to the election.
Who was the ones that were investigating? Was it the police department? Or
was the election board itself that was doing the investigation.
Oh, wow. Okay.
It would have been probably nicer if the police department would have done it because they'd have had more resources available.
Yeah.
You know, the election board was like 3 people plus their deputy and maybe a few staffers. I don't know. Not very many.
Yeah.
So it took a while.
Yeah.
But we also were investigating ourselves. You know, a small group of people were looking at some different stuff. And I was studying nonstop, trying to figure out what happened, look at stuff, do public records requests.
You were just put into this position, too.
Correct.
So it's like, okay, learn this position as well as here's everything that's been here.
Yeah.
Try to figure out and untangle this mess.
Right.
Wow. But you were in there to be able to do the untangling, too.
Correct. That's what I was elected for. I ran on a transparency platform, and I said, we need to start out with this. This needs to get corrected. So that, you know, took us to the end of December. I was sworn in January 9th, I believe it was.
Okay.
And since I was the only one out of that group of people that were tacked on the mailer who won, I didn't really have anybody I knew. I had to learn who I was dealing with. Mm-hmm. I had gone on this legal case against 4 board members I was now serving with. Mm-hmm. So there was
a little tension. Yeah, I'm sure.
But once I got in there, by the end of that first month, we had this, my mind went blank, executive session.
Okay.
And I was overseas at the time. My brother-in-law was getting married in Ethiopia. And so my wife and I flew over there for that wedding. We were going to try and have it so I could Zoom into the executive session, which is legal. Yeah. But it was the middle of the night, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to bed. It's not going to work.
Yeah.
Well, when I got back, they said, hey, we want to have a meeting with you and 2 other board members who weren't in the executive session, and that's legal because it was less than a quorum. We want to have a meeting with you and kind of go over what happened in the executive session. I'd also been sent an email the day after that defined some of what happened in that. Well, when I got to that meeting and they told me what was going on in the executive session, I was like, there is no way that was legal. So they had publicized that they were training the school board members in the performance of their duties as elected officials.
Okay.
Which, that's a broad range of items. You can have quite a bit of training under that, but it is training in your duties. Nothing else. And what they were really doing was discussing shutting down Chandler Elementary School and turning it into a career center.
Yep.
A personnel change, which there is an exception for some personnel things, but it's limited. And that was not the declared reason for the meeting. So you can't discuss personnel under training. The way the law is written, it says that you have to certify in the minutes of those executive sessions that you held to the exception, and you state the exception that you're allowed to have an executive session, and that nothing else is discussed. You have to sign that statement.
Oh, wow.
It gets filed. Like, this is actual government paperwork that you're signing.
Wow.
So you're not supposed to lie about it. So they were discussing that, and then the big one was a referendum, because our last superintendent was convinced that we needed another referendum to stay financially solvent.
Wow, okay.
So the one that we've got on right now ends, I think, in 2026.
Okay.
And so they wanted to do a vote before then. You have to vote within the last year if you're going to extend it.
Okay.
Can't wait till afterward. So they had a limited time when, a vote was going to have to take place. They said, we need to decide how to do this, but the last one barely made it past. So how are we going to get this referendum passed? Well, the group that supposedly was training the board members was a group that runs referendums.
Oh,
so they had their salesperson
explaining that
come there and sell their service. They wanted us to hire them to run the referendum. And so they were telling how they would convince people and all this other stuff. And they were going to do it in an off-election year. The idea behind an off-election year is
not many people.
Nobody shows up, right? Nobody shows up for city elections. Well, you stick it, you only have one item you're voting on, a referendum, and nobody shows up.
Right.
So you could go out there, get your most ardent supporters, go vote.
Get 100 of them in your set. Yeah.
You have, 500 people show up and vote, and they determine a referendum for the entire community. Now, should people care more than that? Yeah, they should.
Yes.
But for a lot of people, they're busy, and it's like, it's one item.
And it's a way to work the system.
Yep. Yeah. And a lot of people probably don't pay enough attention to even know that there is a referendum,
Right.
They're just busy working and trying to survive.
Right.
So they don't realize, hey, there's a vote coming up that has an impact on my property taxes, on how
and maybe
financially
that's
stable I am.
Maybe that's being put in Goshen News, but how many people are watching Goshen News? Maybe it's
Not
here.
that many.
It's like, where there's no centralized source to find this information anymore. Now, it's very difficult to find this information just election-wise for me. So, like, you can hide that very easily.
You can hide it very easily. And so they were open to us when I went to that follow-up meeting that we are doing this.
Wow.
To make sure that we get this thing passed, because there is no way it would pass in a regular election.
Wow.
So they knew it was not a popular deal.
Yeah.
And I said, you guys can't do that. So I filed a complaint with the state, and I said, hey, we're having illegal executive sessions here, and I need a ruling on it.
Wow. Can I ask you a question? So executive sessions, are those taped at all?
No.
So
executive sessions are completely private. No notes are taken.
Cool.
You don't have somebody there doing minutes for them.
Yes, so it's real private. So because typically they're pretty open, like the one that John Troyer came and talked to, the whole thing was taped.
The standard meeting must be public. The public has to come. They have to be able to speak. Well, that one hasn't gone into effect. It goes into effect next year. But you need to allow the public to be there so that they can know what's
going on.
You can't conduct school business.
The executive, and when they said it was for training purposes, well, you don't want the public to come and it's boring. It's a training thing for specifically these roles that you're going to be. But in reality, they're making decisions.
Wow.
Has this been going on for a while?
Yes.
Okay.
In fact, if you look up like the year before, I don't remember how many executive sessions they had, but it was almost at least once a month. And most of them in the previous year, so in 2022, the year before I got on, most of them, as I recall, were related to training in their duties.
Yeah, the real broad stroke of who knows what.
Correct. Yeah. And you don't need that much training in a year. So it's just like, no, this isn't right.
Wow.
And at that point, the superintendent sent out an email. Now, this is not our current superintendent. It is our former. He sent out an email to the board with a big, bold headline. This is to almost all the board members because he left me off.
Wow.
And he said, hey, Ryan is complaining about this. He, filed a complaint. Roger, our board president at the time, has tried to tell him that as a board, you kind of work out your differences behind the closed doors. And once the board makes this decision, everybody just agrees to it and goes along with it. Mm-hmm. And they tried to claim that I was saying I only represent the people that voted for me. And so therefore it didn't matter, anything else. And that's not true. I represent everybody regardless of it.
Right.
But it wasn't just the people that voted for me that this thing affects.
Yeah.
It affects every single person.
The
I said,
whole
look,
community.
The issue here isn't the referendum. Referendums are legal.
Yeah.
The issue is that you're illegally talking about it. You're lying on the forms as to what you're talking about. And you're not giving the community an opportunity to be involved like the law says they're allowed to.
Wow.
So the claim that I was just, trying to represent a minority of people, again, it was just to make me look bad, not to do with the real issue. And actually, in reference to that email, Jose Elizalde wrote back and said, well, we need to not have less executive sessions. We need to have more. Again, why do we need to have more? Why not conduct the business in public? What benefit does the public get? Well, there was a lot of things they were trying to do that they said, well, some people are going to get mad about. Well, that's reality of life.
Yeah.
If what you're doing is good, you should be able to present an argument that is good that most people would look at and say that's a legit argument.
Right.
Now, you might have a fringe either way.
It's just always how it
there
goes.
There always is going to be the guy. I mean, it doesn't matter if you say that, we want to do a statement that the
doesn't matter.
Sky's blue.
Right.
No, it's not. Or that the earth is round, right? Somebody's going to show up and be like, it's flat.
Yeah.
Right?
More so than ever before, probably. It's just
right.
unfortunate. But yeah, it's the bell graph. I mean, you have outliers. There are always going to be outliers on that.
And that's part of being a public official is learning how to deal with people who is an outlier.
Right.
To be respectful, to honor. It is our duty to be more honorable as an elected official than it is their duty to not be upset about us.
Yeah.
And we don't have a right to protect ourselves from upset people saying, I'm upset.
Right.
If you don't want to have somebody say that, get off the board.
Yeah.
That's what you signed up for.
Right.
And a lot of these ideas in doing stuff at executive session was, well, we could talk about anything we want and we don't have to worry about people being upset about it. So, I was like, we've got to stop this. And it did. We had a total of 2 executive sessions there at the beginning like that. I complained about both of them, and they stopped. I mean, I don't think after that, for the next 6 months, we had a single executive session until we were voting on a new superintendent.
Right.
So it worked. And those conversations got pushed into the public. Now, one of the benefits to that was the referendum died because they knew it was unpopular.
Yeah.
They didn't want to talk about publicly because they knew it was unpopular. And once it got out, it was unpopular.
Right.
And I looked at it as a new board member. I said, we don't do a referendum unless the world is ending and we have demonstrated absolute integrity across the system, that we are doing our very best with the money we have, and there's nothing else left. Like, this thing goes down if you don't have a referendum.
Right.
And we definitely weren't there. So I feel like that was a major victory for the taxpayers of Goshen.
Yeah.
Because now in 2026, this referendum is going to fall off. And I think it's like 29 cents per 100, something like that. I haven't looked at the numbers here recently, but
so we'll feel the tax cut.
There will be a tax cut as far as that referendum is concerned.
Wow.
It will fall off, and it's not going to be renewed. But we've been able to, since then, with the new superintendent coming in, balance our budget well enough to not only give teachers raises, but to not need that referendum.
Wow.
So
there was bloat.
There was bloat in there. It was just not
being managed.
There was stuff that wasn't being managed properly, stuff that was wastage. We had issues where things were doubled up, where we had basically too many people in the stack.
Yeah.
And we were able to just become more efficient.
Right.
And the amazing thing about business is the more efficient the business, usually the better it does.
Right.
So not only do you spend less money, but you would think, well, less money equals lower output, right? But it's actually less money equals more output.
Right.
So, yeah, there was just a lot of benefit to that particular thing. With the case of Chandler, they were also trying to close that down behind closed doors because they said people are going to just lose their cork because they're so tied to their community school or their neighborhood school.
It's walkable and it's close.
It's walkable. It's
I go
close.
to it all the time.
Yep.
And
I get that. At the same time, I recognize that there were financial things that we were dealing with as a school system with falling enrollment. You can't always stick with the status quo if things change. You have to be able to work through that.
Improvise, adapt, and overcome all those things.
But how do you work through it? Well, you work through it in public. You meet people one-on-one.
You're transparent.
You're transparent.
It's not done behind doors and then all of a sudden,
You show people the numbers and you say, look, here's where we're at. What do we do about it?
Yeah.
Give us your input. Give us your thoughts. We're going to explain why we're thinking the way we're thinking. I think a lot of people, and I went and knocked on some doors in the neighborhood and asked them about it after this all kind of came apart. And they're all said, we think the idea is good, but it was all hidden from us. We had no idea.
Yeah.
And that was the part they were upset about.
Yeah.
And so I said, look,
wild.
we've got to deal with this. And the superintendent literally said, I want to do this without board involvement because it's easy.
Yeah.
Well, under Indiana law, the superintendent's not allowed to do that. And under our policy, the policy specifically says that the control of all the buildings and programs falls under the board, not the superintendent.
Okay.
So the superintendent can't just walk in and say, well, today, Goshen High School's, it's shut down. It's going to be a career center.
Yeah. The board makes
the board has to make that decision.
Right.
Now, I'm not saying the board would make that decision, but
but
the
it
board
comes
has to.
It's not one person's willy nilly. You talk about it, you think about it. It's open to the public. There's conversation.
Yep.
Yeah.
So by the time they announced it to the public that it was going to shut down, there had not been a single public meeting on the issue.
Wow.
And so people got really
upset,
blindsided by it.
Yeah.
Even the staff, most of the staff found out the day of. So right before the public found out, the staff found out, and they're like, what? Nobody talked to us about it.
Yeah.
So I said, look, guys, we can't do this. We actually have to have a board vote. And our typical standard way of approaching an issue, especially big issues, but in general, was you would have it introduced at one meeting. Mm-hmm. People would go back. We would study the issue. We would discuss it at the second meeting. And the third meeting, we vote.
Okay.
That gives the public time to digest things. It gives us time to digest things.
And you're meeting once a month?
Once a month,
okay.
Typically.
So 3 months of you're slowly moving the ship to the direction you want to go instead of,
If it's major issues.
Yeah.
Like when we had the electric bus issue here recently.
Okay.
And that was brought up over and over and over and over again before a final vote.
Yeah.
It was probably 4 or 5, maybe even more months that was brought before our board.
Yeah.
So to me, the school issue is not a standard issue. It affects a lot of people.
Yeah.
That is an issue you don't deal with in 3 months.
Yeah.
And if you look at the emails, it wasn't dealt with in 3 months.
Yeah.
It was dealt with over a long period. They just dropped the bomb. But I said, you guys got to vote on this. You can't close that school down. So after they already had a public meeting with the parents where they already told them where they were going to be sent to as far as the schools and stuff, which is another issue we hadn't even voted on yet.
Wow. Yeah. How do you distribute them?
They already told them where they were going to be going, how it was all going to be done. A week later or so, we had a board vote. There was no regular, introduction, discussion, that not even the basic minimum. It was just drop it, a very minor little discussion, and a vote.
Wow.
So it was a rubber stamp. So we had to vote on both the school closure and on how we were going to redistribute people.
They've already made
But they've already announced it to everybody. I'm like, this is definitely a case of a cart before the horse.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was still so new as a board member. There's things I could have done differently now because I know the system better, and I could have probably not only
hit the brakes a little bit.
I could have hit the brakes a lot harder.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was brand new. I mean, I got put on in January, and this was February, March.
Wow. Yeah.
Right.
So you're literally, and you're still trying to untangle all the stuff that was going on during the election. I mean, there
was a lot of stuff going on.
Yeah.
But when I look at that issue, once again, is everybody that goes to Chandler Elementary a conservative?
No.
No.
Yeah.
But does that issue affect everybody in there?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
It does. And so because I believe conservatism is not for me and my tribe only,
Right.
if I want to call it a tribe,
Right.
I believe it's for the benefit of everybody.
Yeah.
I was able to then point to that and say, look, this is what's going on here on this board. This board has a transparency issue. This board has a legal issue that they are willing to not only break the law here, but they'll sign the paperwork telling you they didn't discuss it.
Wow. And lie to your face.
Right. We were just being trained as school board members. Not shutting a school down, not changing a principal, not doing all these other things that they were doing. Just getting trained. So, yeah, that was what I found on there. And I looked back at the mailer and I was like, well, it makes perfect sense. Right?
Right. Who's pulling the strings then? If the school board is just kind of rubber stamping stuff, is there? I mean, we don't have to talk about this on there. We can talk about this elsewhere. But that makes me just like, oh my word, And I have those questions about bigger things too, like who's pulling the strings in our government right now? I mean, you start wondering.
Have you listened to my podcast?
Yeah.
I go into some of that because you start to see that there's a lot of crossovers.
Yeah.
And you have a very limited pool of people, primarily, that has most of the power in Goshen. And I think really when you see who was funding the mailer, who was hiding behind that smoke screen, who was attacking the outsiders as, oh, they're going to destroy our school system, it's going to destroy our relationship with the city and all this stuff. They were protecting a system, a way of doing business, a way of managing government in the city. And that's not just a school board issue. That is a government issue, and in general in the city of Goshen, the same people who were backing that were also backing people in the city council.
Right.
I mean, one of them was a city council member now. So you've got this entire group of people hiding kind of in the shadows back here, but then you find them cropping up and they're supported of a few people on the city council, the mayor's office, the boards, and all these different things. Yeah. The school board, I look at it as you have a group of people who wants to make sure that status quo stays the same.
Right.
And that's more than just a board member position. That's why they fought so hard for it. It's not just the schools. It's their entire system. It's dependent on that thing being maintained.
Yeah, all the cogs keep rolling the way they want them to roll. Wow.
Because if you bring in an outsider, somebody who's not beholden to that, you can no longer maintain a status quo control.
Yes.
One of the donors said when he was elected to the city council, he said, my goal is to keep Goshen going progressive. Now, we could have a huge discussion of what progressive means.
Right.
But that idea, that's what they were trying to do. There's a agenda. Here's where we want to go. And if you allow an outsider into here,
it's going to throw our whole thing
that's going to throw our whole thing off.
Yeah.
And so we have to do whatever it takes to stop that. But when you look at the people behind it, that group of people becomes smaller and smaller. Like it's not...
The strings start all...
Right.
It's
not
really,
everybody in your neighbor.
Yeah. It's a small group. I would love to have a chalkboard. We have to do a podcast sometime, a chalkboard, and we put all of the different pieces up and start tying the strings together and explaining the whole... Yeah. I can envision it right now.
I've tried to do it, and it's very complex to do just because there's so many connection points. You're like, where do I even put... Where do I put the lines?
Well, I know what's at the top, Goshen College. But that's my opinion. I think I told this when we chatted on the phone call. I told you that I'm a little into conspiracies, and I've been thinking about how. I mean, this was probably years ago. I was thinking about how the Freemason building is right next to the police department and next to the Chamber of Commerce. They're all right there, and it's all connected. Right. So I'm like, I wonder if the Freemasons are running Goshen. And then as I've thought about it, I don't think it's I think at one point they may have, but that's been sold. That's gone. That's no longer a Freemason building. And I'm like, who are the Freemasons of Goshen? In my opinion, in theory, is Goshen College.
Yeah. If you look at the mailer, you look at the boards, you look at the city council.
What's the string?
You find Goshen College is connected all over it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there's lots of statements, well, we value diversity.
Yeah.
But it's only diversity if it came out of Goshen College.
Yeah.
They don't want my version of diversity in my family because that doesn't match their college's goal, their agenda for the system and for how it's going to operate. And they don't care if it's a whole bunch of people that are all the same.
Right.
Backing that whole system. You look through the donor list and it's like, there's no diversity here. This is just a group of college people.
Right.
They want to maintain that control, and they'll say it's diversity. They'll say whatever they want, but they are just using people to maintain their power.
Wow.
And that's a real issue. I don't look at that. Some people say, well, that's talking bad about people. I'm like, do the research. Every single person here almost is tied to that college.
Yeah. Yeah.
And okay, call Goshen a college town. A college is a college. It doesn't actually have the right to govern. It's a 501c3 too. So that's another issue.
Right.
A college doesn't have the right to govern. The people have a right to govern. And if the people there start to game the system, that's a problem.
Yeah.
If they start to go and manipulate and, I uncovered the use of government resources to oppose the candidates they didn't like. Well, that's gaming the system.
Yeah.
That's utilizing
taxpayer dollars.
You're utilizing taxpayer dollars to manipulate.
Yeah, because you don't like this person.
Now, let's say they'd done everything ethically.
Right.
Maybe they still would have won. That's fine. You won. You won fair and square.
Yeah, based on your ideals, but not.
But you can't game the system to do it. And honestly, they were afraid they weren't going to win, and that's why they gamed the system.
Yeah. And
so,
they didn't win. That's why you got in.
Yeah. In one case, they didn't win.
Yeah.
So,
and it's throwing a cog into their whole
Correct.
system. Wow.
So, again, this is all about how does it impact the average person who's not a Goshen College person, maybe, who's not from their limited subset.
Right.
Who's just the normal person whose kid goes to Goshen Community Schools or who lives in Goshen. How does it affect you? How do we serve you?
I wonder what the percentage is of, Goshen College alumni versus the greater Goshen who what's the percent? Yeah. Wow. Yeah, dude, my mind's blown right now.
Yeah. And it's so complex. Sometimes it's hard to even describe it.
Yeah.
Again, one of the reasons I wanted to do a podcast is because I had a hard time describing everything that went into it.
Yeah.
It was like, if I could take all these different pieces and spend hours, putting it together so that you can understand why I feel like it's such a big issue.
Right.
You listen to that and I don't have to try to think, how do I describe this to somebody? How do you tell people about all the effects that this could have?
Right.
And why should they be concerned about it? Why does it matter to them when they go to vote this next election?
Oh, yeah.
So that's why I feel like that podcast enabled me to do it, because
even just this conversation we've had here, you've really laid out a lot of things. It makes sense. Yep. It makes a lot of sense. I mean, coming from listening to part of that podcast and to then chatting about it, it's like, wow, these are all flowing together. Right? Yeah, that's not.
They're definitely big issues.
Yeah.
And like I said, we have the implications of this. In part 7, I went in, I tried to tie that election to this election because they are connected. The people running now are the same group of people. They have the same support group that tried to game the system the last time. No, are they doing it illegally this time? I have no evidence of that.
Yeah.
That's for other people to determine. I'm not trying to figure that out right at the moment. But what I am looking at is the same people are trying to back these guys. And I've spent 2 years trying to make sure that we operate in a legal, transparent way.
Right.
Part of transparency is being willing to say, hey, you know what, we supported that and we were wrong.
Right.
But they haven't done that.
Yeah.
And then also just acknowledging that, hey, there is representation that needs to be made across the political spectrum, and they're not giving it. When they hide behind those closed doors, they're representing a small group of people. They're not representing everybody.
Right. Yeah. It's these power players that are moving things. How long are you on the board for until you're?
I have 2 more years.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. And so then this election, are there the people that are, is it a certain amount of board members that are kind of, the seats are up right now?
We have 3.
Okay.
So District 2, District 4, and at large.
Yeah. Okay. Do you foresee like the next 2 years have things? I know you were probably the first. You were, like you said, you were in there trying to right the ship by yourself. Do you see the ship starting to turn in a good direction? As from the school,
I think so. A lot of those bigger issues that deal with the transparency, the efficiency, just the general goals of the system. One of the things I realized is, yes, the board was a problem, but a lot of the votes we make are based on the recommendation of the superintendent.
right?
A lot of the information we have is from the superintendent. So if you have a really good superintendent, your work as a board member is much easier than if you have one that's not as good. And so where I think we've gotten better at being a good representative of the community is we have a good superintendent now.
That's cool.
And he wants to operate in the public. He's not trying to have us do any crazy backdoor meetings.
Yeah.
And he said when he was
Executive
applying
privilege.
for it,
Yeah.
on things like the financial management, he said, if you want a referendum, I'm not your guy. I'm not going to do that.
Okay.
I want to run your school system and the money that you got to the best possible ability.
Wow.
Referendum is the world's ending. And he has demonstrated that.
That's cool.
Really, honestly. And the way he's brought in a vision, he's able to coach people. He's able to get people to work together. He puts them onto teams. He's given them something to work towards.
That's cool.
And he's transparent. He's willing to meet with people. He's willing to talk to people. He tells people what he's doing. There's nothing to hide.
Wow.
And I really
That's cool.
appreciate that. So
that
that's where I
now,
feel like
it's in place, and so
It's in
now
place.
it's
Yep.
moving the machine in a better direction.
And again, maybe transparency is an issue that mostly conservatives have championed, but it is not something that is only for conservatives.
Right.
The teachers all benefited when we got our financial management under control.
Yeah.
They got the biggest raise they've gotten in years.
Wow.
We had, lots of thanks from them over what just happened with that. And yet we're still financially balanced. We don't need a referendum.
Yeah.
That's a huge deal. That affects everybody.
Yeah.
We were able to...
We paid our teachers in
Yeah.
and dropped the tax off on the... Wow, that's
right.
crazy.
Yeah, and we're able to look at our curriculum and say, how do we make it so that they have a consistent path through a curriculum, and then they get career pathways at the end. We've opened up all sorts of different career pathways and things like that again, and still maintain our finances.
Wow.
So there's more opportunity. The kids have a clear vision from start to finish.
Yeah.
It's more cohesive. Now, takes time.
Right.
You don't turn the ship.
Right.
You
Slow.
do it. It's slow, steady turn. But our goal is every time it's a little bit better. It's a little bit better. And that's what I think is the impact that I wanted to see. Now,
That's awesome.
there's more things. I've got visions and ideas for the next 2 years that I think would be great assets, and we could make this thing even turn faster.
Yeah.
Where will we go with that? I don't know. But do I want to have more variety on the board? Yeah, I want to have more variety on the board.
Yeah.
Have more representation of people who aren't all the exact same small subset of people.
Yeah.
And that's important.
That's a healthy board.
It's a healthy board. It gives you a lot of things. Now, some people say, well, you need more educators. And on one hand, I understand that. But on the other hand, there's a benefit to having people who aren't necessarily educators, because we aren't going out there and studying day to day how everything's operating. That's the job of the superintendent. The superintendent comes to us and says, here's my recommendations, here's what's needed. We then take that and we go study up the issues. We look into it. We might check reviews on things. We might get opinions. We might talk to some teachers. We might do different things. Each person probably has a different way of dealing with a particular issue that's before the board. But if you're trying to make a change, let's say you're a superintendent, you're trying to make a change that's not very popular, and you've got an educator on the board, who are they going to side with by default, right? With the educator.
Yeah.
Even if that change is actually necessary, nobody likes change. And we all know that.
Yeah.
As much as you might like to say, oh, I always want to do the best, when it comes down to doing it differently, different is hard.
Yeah.
No matter how good it is. And it's real easy to get stuck in a rut. So there are benefits to having a little bit of separation there between these different levels. So, you got a little bit of separation between the superintendent and the board, a little separation between the board and the staff. You have understanding. You take inputs from the different people. But there's benefits to having just everyday people out there make up your board and be able to provide, the outside insight.
Yeah. And they'll see things that
they see things
the educator won't see.
That's not a hard, fast rule.
Yeah.
That's just one way that I look at it, and I try to be balanced in my approach and say I don't represent just teachers.
Right.
I don't represent just parents.
Right.
I don't represent just taxpayers. Right.
Just conservatives. You represent
I represent everybody, and the decisions I have to make within law have to take all those different things into account. Now, hey, if I'm a teacher, I may be like, I want to start out with a $70,000 pay, right?
Yeah.
And we would all love that.
Right.
But that would also cripple our school system and, break our business backbone for the community and make it so you couldn't afford your house.
Right.
Right. So I can't just go say, well, teacher A wants a $70,000 starting pay.
Therefore
we have that.
Yeah.
Therefore
all of Goshen pay for it. Thank you.
Right. So that's where you end up, you take all these different things and you say, what is the best? How do we meet the teacher's needs? How do we meet the community's needs? How do we balance those all out?
Yeah.
And frankly, not be selfish for anybody.
Right.
Everybody's got to look at that system and, be willing to make a good decision out of it and not be jaded towards anyone.
Yeah.
So
that makes sense.
Yeah.
Wow, dude. Yeah, that's crazy. Yeah, it's not easy. It's not an easy task. I'm so thankful that you're in. I appreciate you. Just taking a stand. It's not an easy thing to do. And it's kind of cool how your skill set is set up for this too.
Yeah. It's been a great learning experience, and I hope, however long I am on the board, I hope at the end of it, there's been a great improvement and change with these fundamental principles. Again, they benefit every single person.
Yeah.
And I've never gone in there and said, well, we shouldn't educate, this person or that person.
Yeah.
I said, no, we should educate. But I do believe we should educate to the best of our abilities, and we should stick to education.
Yeah.
There's limits onto it, but we should do what our job is.
Yeah. Oh, Ryan, thank you so much for coming on. We've been an hour and a half. We've been cruising. This has been good.
Hopefully I didn't come across too bad. I could feel the cold trying to take over me, but
this has been so fascinating. Maybe we can do another kind of conversation. I don't know if there's anything else you want to hit, but I think you've really covered.
Yeah. I mean, if you want the story, I was so light on some of that different stuff. If you want the story, the 7-part podcast is, I don't know, it's probably an hour and 15, hour and 20 minutes total, I would guess, somewhere in there. But it has a lot of the source material in it. Yes. I didn't make the stuff up. The few parts that don't have the source material, I'm just a dad, and I didn't have time to get it finished.
Yeah.
But I tried, and most of it, I put the source material there. You could see what was happening. You could see why it's an issue, and you could see why it's a benefit to everybody to not have business done that way.
Yeah. And like you said, our community has only seen the tip, and then when you get into it, you realize the iceberg of corruption.
Yes.
And some of just the really inappropriate stuff that was going on. Like the conversations we've had here is not even the level of depth of corruption and inappropriateness that's happening.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
What we've talked about just on this podcast is pretty inappropriate on some levels.
Right.
You're like, oh my word, like they're doing this and they're doing that, and it's so I'm thankful that you've done the podcast. I think that you've done the work and got in there, and it's kind of cool how you were put in this position for this time. And
Thank you.
Yeah,
I appreciate that.
It's been cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on, bro.
Absolutely.
Yeah. We're typically I let you plug whatever. We'll plug the podcast. It'll be in the links. They can go and click and start watching it right away. If people want to connect with you or contact you, or what's the best way to get a hold of you?
I do have a website, ryanfordgsb.com.
Okay.
That was my campaign website. It's still up. I just never took it down. So you could contact me through there. There's a contact form. RyanforGSB@gmail.com also works if you want to email me.
Perfect.
Yep.
Ryan, thank you so much for coming on Timon's podcast,
thank you,
bro.
Appreciate it.
Peace.